Welcome to the Social Engineer Podcast. The Doctor is in series. This is episode 205. Can't believe we're over the big 200 number. I'm really excited about that. I'm Chris Hanegi, CEO and founder of Social Engineer LLC, the Innocent Lives Foundation, and the Institute for Social Engineering. And I've been hosting this podcast since way back in 2009. And since we call this the Doctor is in series, we need a doctor. Where's the doctor? Dr. Abbie Maroño. No.
The doctor is in.
The doctor is in.
I am Dr. Abbie Maroño. I'm the Director of Education at Social Engineer. I'm a professor of psychology, an expert in nonverbal communication, and I specialize in trust, nonverbal communication, and the psychological mechanisms underpinning human decision-making. And I have a PhD in behavioral analysis and psychology.
And the breeding habits of dustworms.
Indeed.
We just added that. We're going to add a new PhD to Abbie every month that we record this. And before the end of it, she'll have a PhD in everything on Earth. It's just the way it is.
Sounds like a great idea and a horrible idea.
Okay. Well, most ideas have an element of greatness and badness, I think. We should make a podcast out of that. That's not today's topic. Okay, let's do some housekeeping before we get to the awesome topic that we have chosen for today. So first of all, our sponsor for this month is none other than Social Engineer LLC. If your company is dealing with any of the problems that occur because of breaches out there, and the main one we're seeing right now is vishing, that's voice phishing. A lot of companies are dealing with the struggles around vishing because we see that attack has gone up hundreds of % in the last 12 months. So we see this in all areas, banking, healthcare, government agencies, small mom and pop shops, all being attacked through the phone. They're trying to get financial data, credit card data, access to your computers, passwords, all these types of things. If you are experiencing these type of attacks and you're wondering what can we possibly do to make our people aware, that isn't a 20-minute boring video about what vishing is with maybe some half funny cartoon characters, give us a call. We can help you out. Social-engineer.com. Check out our brand new website. You can find out information there about all the services we offer and all the training classes coming up. We have a couple foundational aspects of social engineer training classes coming up, one in Orlando and one in Romania. We have our practical application of social engineering class, which is a combination of our OSINT and our CERA classes coming up virtually in June. And we are working on a brand new class that I'm super excited about that Abbie is writing, all about the psychology of social engineering. I don't have a release date for that yet, so stop emailing and asking, because I promise you, as soon as it's out, we will be yelling it from the rooftops. But you can find out all the information on social-engineer.com. Okay, for everyone who's listening, if you are loving the idea of social engineering, you should hop on over to our Slack channel. We have like over 1,500 people in there now every day talking about SE from the work side. We have people coming in that do this for a living and they're looking for help with their phishing campaigns or red teaming campaigns. We have people coming telling stories about the work that they're doing in that. And we talk about the principles of it, the psychology of it, all different aspects in the chat rooms there. We even have a job board where about 10 people have found employment thanks to companies and individuals posting their jobs or looking for jobs on the Slack channel. So stop on in. You can find the link in the show notes. And if you don't, you can feel free to tweet at either Abbie or myself and we'll get you the link for that, the Slack channel. Also, I want to invite everyone who's listening to go check out InnocentLivesFoundation.org. I cannot tell you how proud I am of the team over there. We're now up to 486 cases. Yep, that number is brand new. I can't believe it, but we're really hitting close to that 500 number. Our mission is to work closely with law enforcement agencies across the globe in tracking and geolocating people who traffic children and harm children by creating child sex abuse material. We do that in legal ways. We're not a vigilante group. And then we work with law enforcement to make sure those people get apprehended and have the due justice that is deserved, saving kids from the harms and of predators. We're also an educational organization, so we educate parents and caregivers and others about the threats that our kids are facing out there. You can find a lot of information on InnocentLivesFoundation.org. You can volunteer to help, or you can volunteer to donate your money. Both are really needed, so hop on over and check that out. And last but not least, if you're a fan of ILF, you must be a fan of Clutch, the best rock and roll band on the planet Earth. Neil Fallon's on the board of ILF, so we love them. But also, Being a huge fan myself, they allowed us to use their music for the intro and outro of this podcast. So go over to pro-rock.com, check out their tours, listen to their songs. And if you hit them up on Spotify, if you click that button up top to donate, that goes all to ILF. So we love them out there. So check them out. Okay, Abbie, that's all of our announcements. What is our topic du jour?
Today, we are exploring how perception is reality, but we're looking at specifically social perception.
This is a really, really interesting topic for me. I think you and I were having a conversation about this, is what this turned into, about how sometimes it's really interesting to see, especially online, masses of people moving in a direction that seems so illogical at times, and wondering how can it be when you know a lot of people are really, really intelligent, but they follow a certain path, and you're like, okay, how can that be? And this topic came up. So explain a little more. What is it that we're going to actually be talking about?
So social perception simply is how we perceive the social world, how we perceive others. And social perception and social cognition, they're not interchangeable terms, but they sit very closely together. And they're centered around the idea that how we perceive and think about the social world isn't based solely on how the social world actually is. And it's not just about we see a stimulus and we see information and then we form logical principles based on that. It's the fact that we have these internal values, needs, and expectations which influence the outcome of our perception. So things aren't always what they seem, but our perception is our reality.
So you said something interesting there. Like we talked about our own beliefs and morals and whatever that affects that. But how is it then, how does like these social perceptions sometimes seem to people go against that belief system or whatever? So how does that work? Like how a social perception that strong of a motivator that it can actually make someone alter something in their own belief system?
Absolutely. Usually it's top down, however. Because social perception is all about how we create our reality, and how we perceive something is how it is to us. And social perception really forms three logical steps in terms of how we have perception of the world. First, we perceive things that are observable. So, if someone moves their hand or you show a facial expression, I have to first perceive it. I have to see that it occurs. And then, because remember, we're talking about social perception as well. So this is going to be specific to our social interactions and judgments of other people and things like that. So here, the second stage is that we now make trait influences based on those observations. So I might see you do something, and now I make an inference about why you did it. And then thirdly, those perceptions and that observation activates these stereotypes that we have inbuilt into us. And we can dive into those stages, those three stages a little bit more. So first we have, as I said, the observable. So we see something. And then second, we generate those trait influences. So if you make a sad face, I have to perceive it as sad for it to be a sad face to me. If you make a sad face, but I perceive it as an angry face, then to me, it's an angry face. So I make that trait judgment.
What would make someone, like if I make an actual sad face, and I do a good job at it, what would make someone perceive it as not a sad face? I mean, wouldn't our brain register as sadness because we're actually making the correct emotions?
Not always. We can go into what affects our perceptions a bit later. I think let's just give some examples of these stages just so people can kind of wrap their head around what it is. But I like your thinking because we're going to dive into how emotions affect these things. But okay, say you see someone open a door and they let someone else pass as they open the door. The trait judgment that you might make is that person is a kind person. I've now observed the observable. They open the door. Now stage 2 is I make that trait judgment based on the observable. And we do it for lots of things. Like we've talked a lot about judgments of trustworthiness based on perceived smiles. Someone might smile. I don't know anything about their trustworthiness. All I know is that they've smiled. But now I make a trait judgment that they are trustworthy. And there's a huge amount of research on how facial features affect trait judgments. For example, we have evolved this ability to judge aggressiveness based on very brief glances at people's faces. And we do it quite accurately. And then the third stage is that activation of stereotypes. So when we see someone and they see, or they're perceived as they fit a social group, we will then activate those unconscious stereotypes that we have associated with that group. So we see them and then we automatically categorize them as being part of a social group.
Yeah, I think about an exercise we do in the foundational aspects of social engineering class, where at the end, we analyze some videos for like nonverbal cues that you can pick up on. And I used to use this one video of this interview of this woman. Her husband went missing, and she held a press conference. And she shows a lot of signs of awkwardness when she first comes out. Like she's fidgeting a lot. She's putting her hands in her back pocket. She's rubbing her hands together like this. And right away, people in the class would go, "Oh, she's guilty of something. She's guilty of something." Right now, she hasn't spoken. There was no indicators of guilt at this point. There's only indicators of discomfort. Right. She was showing heavy discomfort. And I remember at one point I was showing this video in the class, and she comes out and she's doing this a lot. She's like, it looks like she's eye blocking. One of the students says, "Look at that. That's like, you could tell she's guilty, but she's doing that facial expression." And I'm like, yeah, but also look at the direction of the sun. Right. I mean, the sun was hitting her directly in the face. So she was kind of squinting because she walked out from under her garage and the sun hit her. Right. So it was kind of like she's doing that. So you got to, be observant about all of it. But they saw that and right away it was like, no, she killed him. She's guilty, Yeah. And at the end, the story was, what I always tell them is she didn't kill him. Now, he wasn't just missing, he was sadly dead, but she was not the one who killed him. So, we're making that inference that, wow, she was guilty of murder just because you saw a few things that were maybe incongruent. That's like a huge logic leap in what you see and what you believe.
Yeah, but it's also the confirmation bias as well. If you want to believe something, you see it and interpret it as, well, that confirms the belief that I had. Therefore, now this is a reality. When, we see something that doesn't confirm that and we go, oh, it's a fluke. Oh, I didn't see it. Because it doesn't conform with our perception of what we are looking for and what we expect to find. So we kind of just ignore it. And studies have shown as well that we don't have the memory as much for things that don't confirm our belief system. So if we are shown something that conforms with our beliefs and something that does not conform with our beliefs, we have better memory for the thing that conforms with it because our brain just says, nah, that other thing isn't as important and puts more weight to that thing that conforms with it.
So as soon as that class I'm thinking about, as soon as they counted her as guilty, then anything else they saw after that not only proved the guilt, but that anything that didn't kind of got wiped away. So when she was being congruent, like when she showed real sadness or when she shrugged her shoulders properly, they were like, no, that doesn't mean anything.
Yeah. And it's not just about her guilt that we make the judgments of. We make the judgments of, she's guilty because she's this kind of person. We see her behave and then we make a trait to influence about who she is. She showed a lack of emotion there for she's cold and heartless. How can we know that? But that's our perception now. And it's an interesting topic because perception can be very accurate. Like I mentioned that we have this evolved ability to detect threats and detect aggressiveness, and we do. Research has shown that we are very accurate at detecting how violent someone is from brief glance at their face. For example, a really interesting study, and I love this study, showed that they had participants and they showed them registered sex offenders' faces. And they had some who were registered sex offenders who were very violent, and then other offenders who were not violent. And they showed them their faces. And within 2 seconds of exposure, people could accurately predict who was the violent offender just by their face. And it was things like facial masculinity, like a long chin, prominent brow ridges, thick eyebrows, large jaw. And there is some science behind why, because those features are associated with high testosterone, which does affect facial morphology, and high testosterone is associated with aggression and violence, but it's not necessarily linear. So there some evidence of accuracy, but not always. And there are things in us that can affect those judgments. For example, our mood. And I think that's probably the biggest and most obvious one. If you are in a bad mood, you interpret things more negatively. It's called the mood congruency effect. Have a tendency to render judgments that are biased in the direction of how we feel at that time, our current mood state.
And that makes a lot of sense. I mean, not that it's right, but I mean, not that it's like I support it, like it's saying, well, this is the best, but it makes a lot of sense because I mean, we've all had those days where you just wake up, you're on the wrong side of the bed, you're out, everything seems to go wrong, and then you come to work and someone says something that they said to you 1,000 times before and you laughed at. And for some reason, now you just want to punch that person in the face. You're like, why would they say that? That is the worst. What the heck? Don't they know I had a bad morning? You know, of course you don't, right?
Yeah. It's like, you can be in a really bad mood. You can be angry with your partner. And there's studies showing this. If you are angry with your partner and they say things like, have a great day, you're in a really bad mood and you're like, why are you being so sarcastic?
Yeah.
Are you saying that you want me to have a bad day?
You listening into my marriage conversations, Abbie? What are you doing? I don't like bringing up personal things on the podcast, Abbie. Okay, that really hurts me deeply, man.
Maybe you're just interpreting it wrong.
You using our own podcast against me.
You should be so proud. But there is a reason why we do this. And we have to remember that our mood and emotions, they don't just sit in their own corner. They affect everything with our bodies. It's not just you have a mood or an emotion, it doesn't affect anything else inside of you. Our moods come with physiological states that are mediated by our limbic system. Now, different emotions are mediated by different elements of our limbic system. So let's take, for example, anger, because anger is the one that has the biggest effect on how we perceive the world. Now, anger comes with amygdala activity. So we have things like greater cardiac activity. We have things like restlessness and general arousal. Whereas something like sadness, well, that's not mediated and that does not occur in the amygdala. We see this primarily in the hippocampus, which does not have these effects. So when we feel anger, we have this really overstimulated physiological reaction, and our body can misinterpret this feeling that we have as being due to the stimuli. And it's called emotional misattribution. We feel this sense in our body, we feel this emotional and physiological arousal, and we misinterpret that. And I think we talked about this study previously where they had people walk over this like shaky bridge and it created this sense of fear and arousal. And then at the end of the bridge, they had someone ask them out on a date. And either they went over the shaky bridge or just a normal bridge. And people misattributed their sense of fear as sexual arousal because they were in this physiological state of activity. And it just goes to show, we don't often know what's going on inside our body, but how we perceive it will then affect our social perception and affect our interactions.
Yeah, that's always, I mean, when you said that, something came up in my head. It has nothing to do with the emotion part, but like, working with a health trainer, and they tell you, if you skip a meal, your body doesn't know. Like you could tell your brain, you could tell yourself in your brain, hey, I'm going to eat again in another hour. Body doesn't know that. So it goes into a different type of metabolism and storing things because it just says, hey, man, you're not feeding me. I'm nervous. Like you may be starving. I'm going to hold on to all of this. Yeah. So it's interesting the way our bodies work, right? Because, that study, we did talk about that. I think it was a couple podcasts ago. And then you and I talked about it afterward, that you could see that because if it's the same centers of the brain and the same feeling inside, even though logically I may know I was afraid, but then you get asked out on a date and you're like, oh man, I must be sexy, right? That's something, right? And it's just so weird that would be, especially after going over a really shaky bridge,
Yeah, what a nice feeling that must be, Chris.
Yeah, I don't know that feeling. Okay. I've not been on a shaky bridge in a long time, but
Yeah, but so these physiological states, they also affect the stereotypical judgments. So when we are angry, we're more likely to make stereotypical judgments, but we don't see the same effect when we're sad. And there are some studies investigating why we do this. And it is a lot to do with, how we perceive the stimuli and the physiological states. So there's a lot that goes into it. And just because we have this emotional arousal in our body doesn't mean we can't identify what it is accurately. It's just that most of us don't. You have to be very, very mindful to do so. And mindfulness, contrary to popular opinion, is not something that you just are. You can't just be like, I wake up, I'm a very mindful person. I go to bed, I'm a mindful person. I spend my day just, being mindful without thinking. It just doesn't really work that way. You have to actually train mindfulness because it's very, very different, and it goes difficult, and it does kind of go against how modern society has trained us to be because we are not mindful. We are very quick with our judgments. We have stereotypical judgments not because we're rude or horrible people, but because the brain is so energy hungry. Our brain weighs 2% of our body weight, but takes up 20% of our body's energy. So we have things like stereotypes and these perceptions so that we don't have to take in everything that's observable and accurately assess it. We take these perceptual shortcuts because we're trying to save energy and because we need that energy for other things. So of course you have to train mindfulness, and of course these things affect us. And it's actually having this social perception is essential for social interactions in general. We need them.
And I just want to correct one thing. Maybe your brain is only 2%. Mine is 10. Okay. Just saying. 10% of my body weight in my head right here.
In your head, definitely.
Oh, ow. Well, shots fired. Someone call 911 quick. I need an ambulance. Ow, it hurts. Wow. I didn't think Brits knew how to shoot guns. Man, terrible.
Yeah, we use our words instead.
Man, twice in like 10 minutes I've been. Okay. I actually had a question on that, but now I forgot it from the pain. Oh, actually, no, I remember. So we talked about anger and fear being emotions that will create this. So since surprise and fear are related, would surprise be another one?
Kind of. So surprise is very short-lived. Surprise is kind of a gateway emotion because you have surprise, and that surprise is either going to lead you to something positive or negative. Whereas fear, anger, happiness, they're kind of those states that you will then get to. So I wouldn't say so because surprise really is that quick gateway. And if you stay surprised for several minutes and just feel nothing else, I'd be very surprised.
Maybe a little worried.
Yes, well, that would be my secondary emotion.
Yes,
I would feel following surprise.
How about happiness? You mentioned that one. Would that one?
Yeah.
Okay.
So for things like the positive emotions, we do see an effect. Like when you are overly positive and you feel in a great mood, you tend to perceive things too well, not well as in accurately, but you think, oh, it didn't mean to hurt me. She didn't mean to hurt me. Oh, they didn't mean it that way. And you can actually do yourself an injustice because you can say, everything's fine. Everything's, handy dandy. Everything's good. When actually everything isn't good. And being able to perceive things accurately is really important. Seeing them too negatively or seeing them too positively, neither is good. You want to have that moderation effect. So it's not just the negative, but the negative, what we see in the research is the biggest sway factor. Like if you are really positive and you wake up in a great mood and your, partner says, have a great day, what's the worst that's going to happen? You say, thank you. You have a great day too. Whereas with a negative emotion, the outcome of that perception is going to be very negative. So it's going to be, more of interest to you than that positive, really.
Yeah. And I like what you said before, because the it seems like maybe the fix, I don't know if that's the right word for any of the problems that exist, is that self-awareness, that mindfulness piece. But
yeah.
I know, like, starting out when you're trying to become more mindful or thinking about that, it's a tiring process.
Mm-hmm.
Until you train yourself to be that way more, it's like you're starting off and you're just constantly thinking and having to analyze every situation and every statement and every word. And it could be exhausting at times to get there, which is why I would imagine that a lot of people either don't continue down that path or don't even start it, and I feel like you said it, like society and especially social media has kind of designed us in a way where we now expect things to be immediate. If we don't get that immediate response, it's almost like, what is going on? Why are you not answering me? It's been 13 seconds. What's happening? Kind of thing.
Yeah. And when we talk about mindfulness, again, I think society kind of pushes us that when we say we're mindful, it means we know exactly what's going on. We now have this perfect perception of the world, of ourselves. And actually, this idea that we now perceive and understand ourselves perfectly is not mindful. It's actually pushing us in this direction of just being too overly self-critical. Self-critique is not mindfulness, but it's often used synonymously. Mindfulness is understanding ourselves non-judgmentally, whereas self-critique is very, very different. And it's very difficult to get into. So I always say, having guided mindfulness and guided meditation is a good way to start. But just going back to kind of the outcomes of these perceptions, like we said about, the happiness, the sadness, how we now respond on that emotion does have an effect. And if we are not aware of the effect that we have on ourselves and of each other, we can make our perceptions become a reality. Like, I get this all the time because I do have what they call a resting bitch face, and I'm a very mellow person. Like, I
did not see that, by the way.
Well, I have worked very hard to get rid of it.
Oh, okay.
Which you can do for anybody watching. I get that question a lot. But I am quite a quiet, like, mellow person. So I like to just be quiet a lot of the time. And people can perceive that as, are you okay? Are you in a bad mood? I'm like, yeah, I'm fine. I'm literally just sat down thinking. And, my dad would say, are you okay? Sure, something's wrong. No, nothing's wrong. Are you okay? And, you keep asking, well, now something's wrong. Now I'm in a bad mood and I'm irritated. And this is what we call this kind of self-fulfilling prophecy almost. Like, when we perceive someone's actions as a certain way, we have these beliefs. We then treat them as if they are that way and make them become that way. And then, so we call them the target. So we now treat the target as if they are a certain way or they feel a certain way. And those behaviors now create that person to conform to our beliefs about them.
That's, it's irritating because how true it is, right? Because I think I'm guilty of having it happen to me and guilty of doing it. Right. Like, I think about, like, my daughter at times, like saying something like that, like perceiving that she's just in a bad mood and being like, what's wrong? Nothing. And then, like, a minute later, find out she was just tired, whatever, there's nothing wrong.
But then you put her in that bad mood.
Because I asked 10 times. Yeah.
Yep. And there's similar effects really in quite serious contexts. Like, there's this perception that people who have been through the mental health system are violent, or people with severe mental illness, or people who have previously offended are now violent deviants. And what happens is research has shown that now people treat them that way. They come out and they're not that way, but they get treated that way, and they get provoked by the treatment of others to now become angry and aggressive. Like, if you are just trying to find your way in the world and everybody is treating you like you are an angry criminal, eventually you're going to get angry about it. And then you're going to start acting more aggressively because of their reactions and because of their initial judgments. And then it causes angry reactions. Those angry reactions then work to reinforce the original belief that you are this angry deviant. And then this cycle begins where now perceive, act, and now confirmation of perception, and then keep acting towards them that way. And we see this a lot, particularly in the field of forensics.
Let me, and not that I support you, let me play devil's advocate for a second and ask a question, especially on that, like offenders that get out of prison.
Mm-hmm.
So I can almost understand it, like in the sense of, I get a notice or I find online that, 3 houses down, my neighbor has moved in and he got released from prison on charges of rape, right? I don't want to take the risk of finding out that he's conformed by letting my daughter walk my dog past his house, right? And then all of a sudden I find out he didn't conform. He's not a great person, but I find out by a loss. So could those biases that we're talking about, or those stereotypes that we're putting on people, also be a way that we've created like a safety mechanism to avoid potential danger, even though at times it can also be highly unfair because of what you said, that not everyone that comes out of prison will reoffend as a violent offender?
Yep, absolutely. And I think that's a really, really good point. When we have these stereotypes, we have these belief systems, everything that our body does is to protect us. Everything that it does and these judgments it makes, fear, anger, is it a threat? Is it safe? It's all due to it. Our bodies wanting to protect us, our brains wanting to protect us. So we have these stereotypes to save us from being in potentially dangerous or threatening situations. So if you are that person that feels like someone is a danger to them, there is a way to go about it. Either you can remove yourself from that person's presence, and therefore you're not necessarily treating them like a deviant, you're just removing yourself from them, versus going up to them and abusing them and shouting at them and telling them they are a criminal. There are very different ways to go about your perception of them. And I think that's really, really important. Yeah,
that's a really good point. I once was working with, in a different setting, I was working with a woman who, she had said something really shocking. She was deathly afraid of Black people. And I was like, whoa, that's crazy. And I kept asking why, like, why would you even say that? Or why would that be possible? Did you get hurt? Were you mugged? And no. It took like forever just in time to realize that she was raised in a predominantly white area and never even had a friend, never knew anybody that was non-white. So she developed a stereotype based on what she heard on the news and saw on TV. And she said, that's why I'm afraid. And it was like, wow. Like, so a whole, like, she did exactly what we're talking about here. Like she had an activation of a stereotype in her mind based on only something that she's never even experienced, that she just saw on the television, and then made a judgment on a whole people, right? Saying that I'm scared of every one of these type of people because of what I saw on the news from a handful. Right. It's like, wow, when we started talking about this topic, it made me think of that experience, and like, man, that is a crazy example of how this works in us. That is also, like, I don't know even how she would have to be very mindful and probably work with, you said, like guided therapists to get past something like that, because that seems like it would be damaging in your life. Like you would, if you're frozen out of fear because someone of a different race is now walking towards you in the grocery store because you perceive them as a potential threat to your
and then
harm.
Also think about the response that it makes on the people that are now being perceived negatively.
Right.
But I mean, we see this there's a social learning effect too. I mean, we particularly see this social learning with our peers and our parents. So say you're very young, and I'm going to use the example of violent relationships because it's one that's been so heavily studied. You see your mum and your dad, you see how they act towards each other. And say you see your dad now angry and violent towards your mum, but then you see him apologize and love her, and she accepts it and says, this is love. Okay, now you have got this social learning of violence equals love. This is what you are exposed to. This is normal to you because you don't know anything else. You have not seen any other relationships. You have not been exposed to them. You have not learned from them. And now say you see your peer relationships, or maybe that relationship now moves you into this thinking and you get involved with very negative groups. Now the relationships you perceive in those negative groups are very violent relationships. So now you have this social learning effect of violence, love. Violence equals love. from your peer groups. That's, again, a social learning effect. So now as you grow up and get into relationships, what you are going to perceive as a healthy, normal relationship is if someone is violent, that person must really love me because that's passion. And it's not, that's danger. But we can get this effect from social learning. And what it does is it tweaks and it alters our perception of what's acceptable. Because if you think throughout your whole life, what's normal to you is what you've been exposed to. It's like I find out because I'm from the UK and I'm in the US, we have very different like types of humor. And how I see other people joke, it's very dark, it's very blunt, the Brits aren't really offended by anything. And then you come to a different culture and it's very, very different. That's very confusing for me because it's just not what I'm used to. It's not kind of my baseline of how I perceive normal, normality. And it's the same with really anything. What we are exposed to becomes our normal. Yeah. And deviating from that is such this big change to us that it is quite uncomfortable. And whether it's race, relationships, humor, anything, we have this social perception of what is right, what is acceptable, what is the social norm. Because how we perceive the social norm affects our behavior greatly. Because we, as human beings, we really are designed to conform to social norms as much as possible. And when we see someone that isn't conforming to a social norm, that's very strange. And actually not conforming to social norms and deviating from social norms used to be one of the classifications of mental illness, that they deviate from these social norms because that's how ingrained in us they are.
Yeah, it makes me think of I had a friend up north that was from an African country, that it was common in that country that when two men would talk, they would hold hands. And it was a public sign to say, "Hey, we're in a very personal conversation. So if I walked into that restaurant or whatever and I saw that means don't interrupt us. Don't come up and talk to us because we're in a very deep conversation." So I remember the first time I'm sitting with him and he reaches over and grabs my hand, and it was a little shocking. Like, whoa, what's happening here, right? Social norm for him from where he came from. Totally opposite here in America. So yeah, I get that. Like you talked about the humor here and things like that. And if I didn't take the time to say, "Hey, what was that about?" or to explain that to me, and then I could have made a whole judgment on him. Like, that dude's into me. Like I can't, I'm married. I don't want to go that way. I just like whatever. I could have took offense to that whole thing and treated him differently if I didn't find out that, oh, this is just the way his culture is. This is what happens in that culture.
Where stage 2 comes in, that trait influence. We see the behavior, we see them act, and now we make a trait influence. Take it back to the violence. I see them violently. I make a trait influence. This is what I'm used to. This is how I've perceived it, especially with things like parents, because you know the love from your parent to you. So you perceive that as love because they've acted that way to someone that they love. So now you make that judgment about this other person. Well, they must be loving. They must be kind because I see this behavior. Or you see someone act against a social norm and you make a judgment, well, they must be mentally ill. That's their trait to influence, rather than that's probably not their social norm. They're trying to conform to someone else's social norms. They're in an adjustment period.
So how do we improve the social perception then? I mean, this sounds like, obviously we talked about being self-aware and mindful. That seems like a very good first step to work on that if you're finding you struggle with this, but there has to be other methods that we can use to improve this.
Yeah. So when we look at how we perceive others versus ourselves, because we do fall into this mistake with ourselves as well. We self-categorize ourselves and our own behaviors. And when we perceive other people's behaviors, we don't often take into account the context. So we see them act and we say they're a kind person or they're not a very kind person. We don't take into consideration the context, like maybe they're stressed, maybe they're running late, maybe they held the door open for 10 people beforehand and got tired at that 11th person. We've all been there. But when it comes to our own judgments, we over account for context. We say, oh, I'm not a mean person. it was just a long day, a stressful day. You know, I had this, I had that, I was juggling this. Whereas the other people, we say it's, their personality, it's their character. And I think when we are aware of this, when we act and we expect, well, they'll know that it's just the context. They'll know I've had a really stressful day. And again, you see it in arguments with couples all the time. You know, I've just come home, dinner's not on the table. I've been working all day doing this. Yeah, well, I've been doing this all day. And they just kind of butt heads because they're not taking into account the context of each other's, but they're over accounting for the context of their own. Now that we know this, try and account for the context of other people's. When you perceive a judgment of, wow, that was rude, think, was it intended to be rude?
Right.
What did they just go through? How are they feeling maybe? Can I be more considerate of their context? And when you act a certain way and think, oh, well, they'll know I've been through this, or they should know that I've been through this, recognize, well, even if they should, we often don't. So sometimes just telling them, well, you've been through this, or trying to be a bit more aware can really, really help.
My therapist says this statement, you just should all over yourself. She says should is a bad word because you assume that someone has either a knowledge or an understanding of something that they don't. Right. Mm-hmm. And when you were saying this, I'm thinking of this one account for me. This is when I learned this lesson. I was driving in Washington, D.C., and like 4 lanes are coming to one because of construction. And there's a guy sitting at the exit and no one's letting him in. I give him a little flash of the lights, say, I'll slow down. And I slow down enough so he can get in front of me. Now, what should have happened is the obligatory wave to thank me for letting him in. That's a standard thing. No wave, no light flash, nothing that I can see. And I'm like, this guy needs to run off the road, flip his van. He needs to die in a miserable death, right? Like, this is so terrible that he would not wave to me. Like, this is the reason why people believe in hell, right? That one single person, that's it. Well, after the traffic clears up, I go to pass him, and the guy had one arm, right? Clearly see this arm was not there.
Yeah.
Maybe he didn't want to wave because he didn't want to take his only hand off of the wheel, right? And it was a great moment for me going, wow, I spent 5 minutes, 6 minutes being angry at some poor guy who had no, probably would have waved or said thank you, or he maybe even verbalized it, but I couldn't hear it, and had a legitimate reason for not taking what I perceive to be the obligatory action of a hand wave. One arm.
And I think that's a great lead into reminding people that we carry over our emotions into other people's judgments. So be mindful of what you are carrying over into that judgment. Is it your mood? Is it your context? Is it just maybe you're just quite an angry person? We all have baggage in general, from our previous histories, from our childhoods, that will affect how we perceive the world. Our relationship with our parents, our relationship with our siblings, our relationship with ourselves affect our judgments. Our religion affects our perceptions. Things that we don't even think will affect our perceptions affect our perceptions. Have a think about what you're carrying over, and is it fair to hand that to that other person and say, well, they didn't hold a door open, so they're a horrible person. Consider their context.
It sounds like it could be a topic for another whole podcast because, when I think about that, I think of, that's such a huge topic, right? That what you just said, and managing that could be so hard, right? Because like you said, especially if it comes from things from our family of origin, you're now carrying things that are deep in your psyche. It's not like I just woke up in a bad mood this morning and I can say, well, Abbie didn't mean the joke that way. I'm just in a bad mood. This is like something that may be from my childhood. And now I need to, like you said, if I'm just an angry person, I need to consider that I'm always perceiving people to be this way towards me, but it's because I'm an angry person because XYZ happened to me when I was a kid. That's a lot harder on a daily basis.
Yeah. And we have to remember, like I said, our perception becomes our reality.
Yeah.
Be careful how you treat people because you might end up making them that way. So there's a great quote that I love, and it just says, if we create our reality, what reality do you want? Decide what kind of person you want to be. Do you want to be someone that is mindful and is considerate And you have to work at doing that because it doesn't come naturally to us. Or do you want to be someone that carries that baggage over with you? I don't, but it's not something that happens overnight. You have to recognize that our perception of the world isn't correct. And there's that picture of the dress that is either silver and gold or red and blue.
Blue, yeah.
Yeah, and I've never seen anything other than silver and gold.
All I see is blue.
I've never seen that. And it angers me so much, but it's such a great illustration of how
it really is.
When we perceive something that way, we cannot understand how anybody else could perceive it that way, but they all feel exactly the same. So we have to recognize maybe my reality isn't perfect. Yeah. Maybe it's just my reality, not your reality, not their reality.
What I love about as we're ending, what I love about it is that there's hope, right? Like sometimes you start out with these topics and it sounds like, wow, we're all doomed, right? My emotions are going to affect my perception. My perception's going to make a stereotype judgment. That judgment's going to make me treat people a certain way. And that's the way we are as humans. Hey, have a nice day, folks. See ya. But now we're saying like, hey, if you don't like that, right? If you don't like that, I remember, when COVID first started and there was just all this anger in the world and people were just so angry at everything, I started to deeply look at my social media following and to figure out if the news programs I were following, the sources I was getting media from, what were they doing to me? And I found it was just garbage. It was constantly filling my brain with violence that cops were committing and violence that was happening in the world and violence against kids. And I'm like, I need some form of positivity in my life because it was literally just one bad news story to another, to another, to another. And, I'm not one of those people that I don't want to know what's happening in the world. Don't tell me, like, that's too bad for them. That wasn't it. It was just, I wanted to have something in my feed that was going to make me laugh, or make me smile, not just go, wow, another school shooting or another cop shot somebody, something fun or lighthearted. And I had to personally make that change. I had to figure out like, okay, I'm going to add this in, add that in. So that way I could still get news, but I can also get some of the other positive side of it. That did help. That helped change the way I was perceiving the world at the time because it just seemed so bad, like nonstop. Yeah, it's really interesting topic. I'm really, really glad we had that conversation outside the podcast and then ended up turning this into a great episode.
And for once, I actually have a podcast topic that leads on nicely and isn't just a big jump.
Which is?
From the previous topic. Well, next episode, we're going to be looking at what's underneath the conspiracy, but we're going to be flipping it into a slightly different angle that does lead on from this one. So stay tuned for that.
It's going to be a great episode. And as always, Abbie has been kind enough to provide a long list of references and studies that lead to the discussion that we had here today. They'll be all in the show notes. So if you're interested, if you're one of those that like to read the science behind our discussions, we'll have all of those listed there and you can find them in your reference libraries on the Social Engineer website. Thanks again, Abbie. Look forward to next month's session because
we can do it weekly.
I know you want that, and maybe someday we'll get there. And I know there's a lot of people now that you said it, they're going to be emailing like they have every month. But we'll see. I mean, I don't know if my brain can handle this much. So this is great. But I'm really looking forward to conspiracy theories because it's something that I've talked about and pondered about for forever. So thanks for tuning in this month, everybody, and we'll see you next month. See you.